This is a talk that I prepared for a local historical society. In this presentation, I want to explore the extent of political agitation in the 1860s which led up to the 1867 Reform Act. This was the first act of the British Parliament that gave the vote to working class men. The act was restrictive in that it did not extend it to all adult males, and essentially confined the vote to skilled working class men who lived in towns. It excluded the unskilled and almost all those who lived in rural areas and in the English countryside. In my presentation, I will be focusing on the West Yorkshire area, then known as the West Riding, and on the town of Halifax, although also considering the national context. A key element that I want to at least tentatively illustrate is that the parliamentary reform of 1867 was not a gift by enlightened politicians in Parliament, but rather it was a response to the political agitation for parliamentary reform that had continued from the early 1860s leading up to the Reform Act of 1867. In particular, I want to illustrate that this period of agitation was more or less continuous from 1860 and did not only consist of heightened agitation in the preceding 18 months before the Reform Bill itself was passed in 1867. In general, historical accounts do not look at the agitation prior to 1865 and normally focus on the high point of activity during 1866 up to and including 1867. Other historical accounts will identify the formation of the National Reform Union in 1864 as a prelude to the 1867 Act. However, in this presentation, I would suggest that agitation for reform that eventually led to the 1867 Act can be identified from 1860 onwards and flows directly from the organisation and agitation that began around Russell's abortive 1860 Reform Bill. What we see is the development of local reform organisations and several orchestrated campaigns to develop public support. These begin in 1860 and occur regularly up to the 1867 Act itself. I want to suggest later in this presentation that this prolonged and more deeply rooted agitation was significantly important, and that the development of local organisations that arose out of the agitation for reform and were led by radicals within the Liberal Party is an underestimated factor in the attachment of working class voters who were then franchised in 1867 and then for over 4 decades were strongly attached to the Liberal cause. This attachment to the Liberal cause significantly then delayed the formation of a socialist working class party, where similar parties were emerging in continental Europe and indeed in the United States. The British Labour Party would not be created until 1901, first called the Labour Representation Committee. Nor would it succeed in attaining sufficient electoral support until after the social dislocations and tragedies of World War I. Working class support remained, up to that time, largely with the Liberal Party. Before we look at the evidence of agitation in West Yorkshire, it is appropriate that we consider what parliamentary representation existed prior to the 1867 Reform Act. The qualification to have a vote between the first Reform Act of 1832 and the Reform Act of 1867 was restricted and based on a property qualification that excluded the majority of the population. Equally, the distribution of parliamentary seats was not equal, nor of a common type, such as it is today, where they are based upon an average size of voting population, with some variation for the sparsely populated area of Britain. The qualification for voting between 1832 and 1867 consisted of two elements. Firstly, in county seats, you had to be a 40-shilling freeholder or a £10 copyholder or a £50 per year leaseholder. In parliamentary boroughs, a different type of seat, there was a more uniform franchise consisting of male owners and occupiers of property worth £10 in annual rateable value. We can see the results of this by looking at a copy of the poll book for Halifax Borough for 1857. Given that this was a large industrial town, the number of voters are listed on just one page and a small section of a second page, in total consisting of just 1,488 electors. Although some histories present an image of political debate between the established political parties of the Conservatives and Liberals to increase or not to increase the franchise, the reality was that this debate was centred around minor changes in the franchise concerning how much or how little the annual rateable value should be reduced. The debate was not about universal principles of suffrage. The conflict was therefore less sharp than is sometimes presented. In essence, the lower the rateable value, the greater the number of people that would then be able to be included in the franchise. The debate was not about the universal right to vote. Although the Chartists had raised the banner of universal male suffrage in the 1840s, and there is evidence that this remained a demand amongst working class people in the 1860s, this was not a debate between the Liberals and the Conservatives. To get a sense of who would be included if there was a change in the rateable value as a voting qualification can be illustrated by the Halifax Guardian in 1860. They published suggested figures in relationship to Halifax, actually arguing that the differences between a reduction of £8 and a reduction of £6 was in Halifax fairly insignificant. As the chart shows, there would have been a small increase in the number of voters for each change suggested, and therefore the actual change in the total voting population would be quite minor. What then was the distribution of seats in Yorkshire? In addition to the voting qualification, the other key issue was that of seat distribution. The big issue for West Yorkshire is that in terms of its population, it was grossly underrepresented, with a disproportionate number of seats still being in the southern counties and boroughs of England. The 1832 Act went a little way in changing this, but still left disparities which became greater as the century wore on because of the larger population increases in the industrial areas of Lancashire and West Yorkshire. The Reform Act of 1832 now divided Yorkshire into 3 county constituencies, each of which returned 2 members of Parliament. The divisions was based on the 3 ridings, which were the traditional medieval subdivision of Yorkshire. The polling place for the West Riding constituency was Wakefield, at which the election hustings were held and the results was declared. The total Yorkshire county representation increased from 4 to 6 under the 1832 Act, with West Yorkshire now having its own Pacific representation. In terms of the borough seats, the 1832 Act had removed a total of 10 parliamentary borough seats from less populated towns and villages and reallocated these 10 seats to the newly emerging industrial towns in West and South Yorkshire. These were Bradford, Leeds, Sheffield and Halifax, each of who received 2 seats in Parliament, and Huddersfield and Wakefield 1 seat each. Between 1832 and 1867, this gave the geographical area of the West Riding a total of 16 parliamentary seats, the 10 new borough seats, the 2 existing seats at both Pontefract and Knaresborough, and the 2 county seats. Illustrated here is the number of voters involved in the 1835 election for the West Yorkshire County, literally encompassing a large number of both small and medium towns. This low level of representation can be seen by looking at the national voting figures and the percentage of the adult population eligible to vote. As can be seen, the increase in those eligible after the 1832 Reform Act, still historically labelled as the so-called Great Reform Act, only marginally increased those eligible to vote, rising from some 5 to 7% of the population. During the course of the century, as it progressed, this increases to around 16% just prior to the 1867 Reform Act, due largely to inflation, so that it brought more people into the rateable qualification. Finally, we should comment on the situation after the 1867 Act. We are still then talking about the minority of the population eligible to vote. This is largely because of the exclusion of women, but also there remains a significant large percentage of working class men excluded. There had been several attempts by Lord Russell of the Liberal Party to introduce limited electoral reform in 1852, 1854 and then again in 1860. But all these founded upon opposition both within the Liberal Party and strongly from the Conservative Party. In particular, there was opposition in the form of Lord Palmerston. It was the death of Palmerston in October 1865, following a Liberal victory at the elections that year, with Lord Russell subsequently becoming Prime Minister, along with Gladstone as Chancellor of the Exchequer, that was to set the scene for the final drama of 1866 to 1867. Although Russell had put forward reform bills during the 1850s, it appears that organisation for reform in local areas was then limited in that decade. What we see is that the anticipation for another bill in 1860, following the election of the Liberal government in 1859, and the period during which the bill is being presented to Parliament, there is a greater response and excitement in anticipation of a reform than previously in the 1850s. Overall, we can say that there seems to be a marked change in the response to the 1860 bill, whereas in the 1850s such moves were largely confined to actions within Parliament itself. Following on from the defeat of the bill in 1860, the subsequent years are most often written off. However, as the chart illustrates, there is evidence of a change in local areas, largely through reports in local newspapers. If we therefore examine what is happening in the local areas, we begin to get a different picture than is presented in the general history books. In the general histories of the period, as I have already noted, what is indicated is that Russell presented his bill in 1860, and then the narrative skips to the year 1865 come 1866, following the death of Palmerston, perhaps also mentioning the formation of the National Reform Union in 1864. This, then, is seen as the beginning of the campaign for reform, and not the previous 5 years. However, not only was the campaign in the country during 1860 very extensive, even if this was not reflected in Parliament, but subsequent campaigning continued up to 1865, rather than merely starting in 1865. The characteristic of that campaign was built around the presentation of Private Members' Bill on Electoral Reform by Edward Baines and Peter John Locke King. However, the extent and orchestration of the campaigns indicate that at a local level, radical liberals were organising and coordinating them in those local areas. What then was the pattern of agitation from 1860 to 1865? I'm now going to return to a previous slide and map out the various bills presented to Parliament by these liberal reformers, and now consider the quantity of public meetings on the issue in selected parts of the country. This first slide shows the number of meetings held during the Russell Reform Bill of 1860. If we compare the number of meetings nationally to those highlighted for the West Riding area, we see 21 meetings in total, and in proportion there are 3 within the West Riding area. Following the defeat of the bill, there was a 6-month lull in public campaigning, and there was only one public meeting held on the issue of franchise in Leeds. The withdrawal of the Russell Bill was by May widely anticipated, as was clear that within Parliament there was minimal support. The attitude was summed up by the Times newspaper in June 1860. The report begins: "Yesterday the Reform Bill, the 10th or 15th of the title, breathed its last in the arms of Lord John Russell. The daily bulletins which we have given you for the past 3 or 4 weeks will have been prepared the public for the event. Lord John himself, in the spirit of the old saying, 'The King is dead, long live the King,' had no sooner proclaimed the decease of the late bill than he announced a successor early next session, with a somewhat safer title. To this we are to transfer our faith and allegiance, though as yet all we hear of it is that the deceased bill professed to be less than its predecessor, so the next heir is to exhibit a still lower scale of political existence." The end of the long article then sums up the situation as follows: "Unless something unexpected should provoke a new interest in the subject, the people out of doors will leave it all to Parliament. We are told that 6 million persons are unrepresented, and no more than 16,000 have petitioned for the franchise, and as long as that is the measure of reform out of doors, it is vain to expect the House to run the risk of self-immolation. Martyrdom must have its grand cause, its admiring spectators, its devoted imitators, but a sacrifice for people of whom only about 1 in 5,000 cares a straw about the matter is a very cheerless finale of a political career. Let the 6 million to whom John Bright alludes and to whom Lord John himself appeals respond to the invocation. Let them come and say what they want and what they will have. It may be granted to their inopportunity, but not to their silence or their indifference, perhaps their contempt." However, that was not to be the end of the matter. Critical to what happened is that the process was not left to Russell. Rather, the radical liberals began organising to mobilise support in the country. The remarks of the Times was to come back with a vengeance during the turbulent period 1866 to 1867, when not 6 million but over 1 million people participated in various protests and meetings for reform. However, prior to those events, popular support was being built up in the local areas. Scattered throughout the newspapers from 1860 and through to 1865, there are report after report of small and not so small announcements about local political unions, of committees for reform being set up, and of public meetings. It is significant that this begins in 1860 and not later. One example of this comes from the local newspaper, the Huddersfield Examiner, in a report of a meeting on the 11th of December 1860, where there was, quote, a large meeting in the Victoria Hall of Leeds Town Council inaugurated the Leeds Working Men's Reform Association. The meeting had previously been promoted and organised. For example, seats were reserved for individuals who had already agreed to join the association, indicating that the association was planned and did not come out of a meeting itself. The fee for non-membership to attend the meeting was 6p. The individuals involved: in the chair, Alderman Middleton. On the platform there were leading Liberal politicians, John Bright MP, Edward Baines MP, and local MP E.A. Leatham, plus several members of the town council. The room was reported as being filled. What can we draw from this? Firstly, the formation predates the national... Start again. What then can we draw from this? Firstly, the formation predates the National Reform Union and the later Reform League by 4 years. That the local Liberal Party establishment was planning and organising the event. That it was relatively expensive to attend, 6p, and would likely exclude at that rate unskilled working men. And finally, that the radical Liberal MPs were involved. At the meeting, a Mr. Greaves, billed as a working man, moved a resolution which stated, quote, that this meeting is of the opinion that the working classes of the United Kingdom have a just claim to a fair share of the representation of the country in Parliament, and it regards with great satisfaction the formation of the Leeds Working Men's Reform Association, with a view to promotion of a sound measure of parliamentary reform. End quote. The resolution is somewhat vague, but an important element is the title of the association and the wording of the resolution. It specifically addresses the working classes of the United Kingdom and working men. And working men forms part of the title of the resolution itself. It seems clear that the Liberals were making a definite play to mobilise the working classes as a social base to support reform under the banner of the Liberals. I should be clear that at this stage the evidence points to it is the respectable working class, those who were likely to be covered by any parliamentary reform, that is the target audience of these meetings. Edward Baines, speaking at the meeting, makes this point, which is reiterated by many other Liberals and Conservatives at this time. The criteria was that people should earn the right to vote, with respectability as a catchword used at the time. The paper reported that, quote, what he wanted to prove was that a much larger number of working men were entitled to the franchise by their conduct, their evidence of intelligence, of virtue and increased education, end quote. The evidence and justification for this was provided by a list of markers that denoted this worthiness. I quote again from the article. He told them also that there were in circulation in the town 2,540 daily periodicals, 47,000 weeklies, and 29,988 monthly publications. The saving bank deposits in one bank alone numbered 12,878, and there were many other saving banks beside the one he named. The members of provident and friendly societies numbered no less than 23,093. The members of benefit building societies were 7,423. The members of temperance societies at least were 5,000. A voice shouts out 12,000. He also stated that the working classes are better fed and better clothed and lodged, as well as better taught. They are in every respect more respectable. End quote. The structure of the Leeds Association is then repeated over the next 3 years in one part of the country after another. 6 months after the withdrawal of Russell's Reform Bill, Edward Baines and Peter John Locke King put forward separate reform bills, Baines for the borough franchise, Locke King for the county franchise. The purpose of the bills was clearly to keep the issue of reform on the agenda, but more so that these bills would act as a catalyst and focus for popular campaigning around the country. They would act as symbols to mobilise support. The proposals in both bills mirrored that originally put forward by Russell in 1860, rather than watering down the proposals for reform. The bill, however, was not merely presented in Parliament. There was clearly an organised series of public meetings which began just prior to the bill's introduction and ceased when the bill was expectantly defeated. We can see in the chart the number of meetings held, which was now exceeding those held under the Russell Bill of 1860. The agitation in the country was growing. It is unlikely that Baines and Locke King expected their bills would be passed in the same Parliament that defeated the Russell Bill. The purpose is likely to have been different. It was to sustain and grow the agitation for voting reform, utilising Parliament as a platform. The importance was the mobilisation of support for these changes around the country. At the same time, acting as a focus and stimulus for local areas to organise and set up reform committees and groups in the different towns. The impact of these actions can be seen in the formation of various organisations, both of working class men and those explicitly aimed at organising for voter reform. In February 1861, there was a discussion on forming a Bradford Working Men's Reform Association. In March 1861, the first meeting of the London Political Union was held, and then the Norwich Political Union was formed. In June 1861, there was a merger of the Halifax Household Suffrage and Ballot Association with the Halifax Parliamentary Reform Association, uniting two organisations to press more firmly for voter reform. And finally, in these examples I'm giving, in March 1862, there was the foundation of a new working class association for parliamentary reform in the large city of Manchester. Following the 1861 campaign, there was something of a break in terms of the parliamentary activity. However, during this time, the number of local reform organisations was growing, and there were irregular snippets of reports about monthly and regular meetings in local newspapers, and it seems clear that on the ground there is activity and organisation. Plus we also see the occasional public meeting, such as a large one in Manchester, along with various meetings that are held in the West Riding area, which are again regularly reported in the local newspapers. The intervening 2-year period before, in March 1864, once again Baines and King introduce a private members' bill. King and Baines introduces their private members' bill in March 1864, and this is a point when we see again a rise in the level of activity around the country, with a series of more intense meetings, and with 3 particularly held in the West Riding over a short period of time. The activity around the 1864 bills dies down in June. For the remainder of that year, up to Christmas of 1864, there is a major meeting by the National Reform Union in Manchester and 2 large public meetings in Edinburgh and Bradford. Following the annual conference of the Reform Union in January 1865, we see once again the build-up of another campaign, leading up to Baines introducing yet another duplicate of his £6 rateable borough bill at the end of February. There are a whole series of large public meetings in Leeds, Manchester, Nottingham, Chester, Halifax, Ashton-under-Lyne, Bolton and Bradford. Baines introduces his bill in February, and there are again a series of meetings. Several this time open-air meetings involving thousands in attendance. In Leeds, another in Holbeck. This campaign then itself dies down in the June of 1865. During 1865, the National Reform League is also officially formed. Taking an overview of the evidence, we can now see that the period 1860 to 1865 was one of preparation and growth in agitation for voter reform. It was not a period void of activity, which then only picked up in 1865, and that the concentrated period 65 to the 1867 Reform Act being the concentrated period. Indeed, the period is critical in assessing both the strength of the movement that developed between 1865 and 1867, but it is also the foundation that the radical liberals made with the formative working class movement. It was a movement aimed at those who would subsequently be franchised within the respectable working class. Palmerston died on the 18th of October 1865, and Lord John Russell became Prime Minister. This period onwards, up to the passing of the 1867 Reform Act, has been extensively narrated by historians, and is normally identified as the time period within which the processes leading to the Act are played out. I hope I have provided some indication that the period 1866 to 1867 is not the beginning, but rather it is an extension and growth upon a response that had already happened. It is a garden already carefully tilled and prepared. The story of the Reform Bill is fairly well known. On the 12th of March 1866, a Reform Bill of modest proportions was put forward to Parliament. It proposed a rental qualification of £14 in the counties and £7 in the borough. This proposal was defeated by a revolt of Liberal backbenchers led by Robert Lowe. They have gone down in history as the Aldermites, after being referred to as the Cave of Alderham by John Bright, which is a reference to a verse in the Bible, 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2. It describes the cave as, quote, where everyone that was in distress and everyone that was discontented gathered." End quote. Parliament's lack of enthusiasm for change led in June 1866 to Russell's resignation. Derby assumed the role of Prime Minister in the Lords, with Disraeli leading the Conservatives in the House of Commons. In 1867, the Conservatives themselves introduced their own reform bill, which after amendments became the 1867 Reform Act. Historical interpretations of the causes of the 1867 Reform Act tend to focus on national events, Parliament, and what happened in the streets of London. These are important, but they leave out of the picture a more detailed feel and appreciation of what was happening around the country, as I have tried to examine in this presentation. I am sure you are familiar with what is known as the Whig interpretation of history, which presents the past as a progression towards greater liberty and enlightenment, culminating in modern forms of liberal democracy and constitutional monarchy, a progression which in some ways has been granted to the people of Britain by its own Parliament. Parkes, for example, in his large work, The English Reform Bill of 1867, published in 1920, argues, quote, "The demand for reform from without had been of little importance during the early 60s, meaning the 1860s. The bill of 1860 had to be abandoned, and no new bill was brought in by the government because of the apathy of the nation. The middle classes were in power, their political and economic wants satisfied, and they troubled themselves very little about the working classes." End quote. Whatever research Parkes had done, he clearly did not trouble to look into West Yorkshire. Equally, the slight of phrase that the government did not introduce any further bills hides from us the several bills that were introduced by backbenchers, each of which we have briefly looked at and which we have mapped against the ferment and excitement in the country and the development of local organisations for parliamentary change. Parkes goes on to establish the primacy of the parliamentary manoeuvres as a key factor in reform, and along with this the backdrop of rising agitation of the economic crisis of the mid-1860s. These were factors that did have an influence in the eventual outcome, but what Parkes misses is the sustained agitation and the building of a grassroots movement throughout the country from the early 1860s. The Whig version of history has of course been challenged and even ridiculed by a variety of historians over the past 60 years. But in spite of much academic historical discourse, like a ghost of a discontented ancestor, it still seems to continue to haunt our houses. In terms of the 1867 Reform Act, we still see historical comments that attribute this reform entirely based upon the parliamentary conflict between Disraeli and Gladstone, and either ignores or plays down as insignificant the mass agitation that swept the country in the years 1866 to 1867, and the organisation for that agitation that preceded it in the previous 6 years. It was Royden Harrison who in the 1960s challenged both the Whig interpretation of history and other historical views that focused upon the competition between Disraeli and Gladstone as leading to the 1867 Reform Bill. Harrison's 2 essays are excellent in discussing these issues. They are titled The 10th April of Spencer Walpole, The Problems of Revolution in Relation to Reform, and the second one, 1865 to 1867, and the Reform League and the general election of 1868. Both these argue strongly that external pressures were a significant factor. Nevertheless, Harrison's focus, as indeed for many historians on this issue, is to focus primarily on the events in London, with more general references to the formation of the Reform Union and the Reform League as national bodies. My own focus in this presentation has been to initially explore the reform movement on the ground with a focus in West Yorkshire, although this could be repeated in other parts of the country. I believe that this focus on the grassroots movement gives us a better understanding of the broader national events. As the chart focusing on the broad politics of the 19th century England illustrates, that following 1867, working class voters largely identified with the Liberal Party. Even with the rise of socialist organisations and independent working class political formations in the 1880s, it was not until the end of the century that the working class moved away from the Liberal Party. What a close review of local organisations of the reform movement of the 1860s reveals is that the process of attachment of the working class was more deeply rooted. We can see in a period of 6 to 7 years leading up to the Reform Act and then the 1868 general election that the Liberal Party at a local level was actively engaged with working class potential voters, and in this way was able to ideologically draw them into the Liberal cause.